Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna go through some of the works that I did since I started making art. This guy is the engineer who developed the irrigation system in the area that I'm from. I'm from Patagonia, from a really dry area. This guy made it possible that we would grow apples. He was from Rome. His name was Cipoletti, and this is the name of the town. And this sculpture sits in the roundabout at the entrance of the town, and it was the first sculpture that I ever saw. These are the apples that we grow, thanks to that guy. And so when I was a child, I always wanted to get really close to El Ingeniero, as we know him. And so I climbed the pedestal. I would like to I used to like going around the legs. And I don't know, that was kind of my favorite game until I fell to the ground. And that was the first bone I ever broke. And I like to see it as an introduction to a very traumatic relationship to public sculpture. This is what maybe, I don't think only retrospectively, but even at the time felt like the first sort of artwork or something that I took seriously. It was right after my VA. This is not the artwork itself, this is background information. The image that you see on your left is the house where independence was declared from the Spanish colony in Argentina in 1816. It's a small house in a small town in the north of the country. Argentina is a very large country, so not a lot of people have been there. But of course, it is a very important monument now, and it has become an icon. And the main difference between the icon and the actual place is the color. The icon is yellow, so even if you go to visit the now museum that is actually white, you can go across the street and buy a souvenir which would be yellow. So what I did was a work which was called Class Period, in which I rang a school bell and dyed the facade of the monument yellow for 40 minutes, which is the duration of a class period. And at the time, this is me. I was wearing a pinafore, which is the uniform that both students and school teachers wear in Argentina. It's one of these sort of utopian ideas of equality, where everybody covers their clothes and they all look the same. I didn't do anything. I just rang a bell, but I was wearing that thing. I guess at the time I was really concerned with images and the way that we learn through them, and the way that, especially in Argentina, which was a country which was populated by immigrants, images were used in school as a way of imparting a common imagery, imaginary and history. And you know, I was working as a teacher at the time, so it felt like I was being asked to reproduce these images, and I was at the same time in my own practice questioning whether there are images that can work as language, whether we learn something through them, and so it seemed appropriate that these two sort of aspects of my life would come together. And I was also wondering why most artists that seem to be thinking and interested in thinking or something close to meditating about language, which was conceptual art as I had learned it. It was always black and white, so I was also interested in sort of learning a little bit about how color might work, if it works, and what role it might play in meaning, or whether it always remains as a sort of subjective, emotional aspect. The following time that I got to be close to a monument, I had a crane, so it was much easier. This is a video documentation from an intervention that I did. The film became its own thing, and the public intervention was basically this horse painted white. So it wasn't a performance, it was just a white horse. People often wonder what it's painted with, so no, it's not paint, it's just chalk. It doesn't have any glutinous components, so it doesn't damage the monument. And it was related to a saying that we have in Argentina, which wonders what color is the white horse of the general. So I always thought it was not only this sort of stating the obvious or a silly riddle that people ask children, but also it was a bit of an example on how we were always taught history in these sort of legendary terms, in which like these magical heroes ride these wonderful, pure white horses. And so what I wanted to do with this work was try to sort of bridge that gap of history as we learn it, or as we're taught, or as we imagine it when we're children, and the way that we experience the reality of it, in this case the monuments, and also to create an image of that sort of magical hero that would not withstand time, so it did wash off with the rain. This is a piece I'm not going to talk a lot about, but these are experiments. The reason why I wanted to show it is because I very often will do on the side experiments that are more sort of studio-based and try to work out what certain pieces can mean when you take them out of context. So these are just, this is a collection of slides from different equestrian monuments from the different parts of the world, in which I sort of excised the horse from the slide itself, so it became white but also absent, and it left the person on top in the air. My favorite one is this one over here, which is Anita Garibaldi. You can't really see it here, but she is firing a gun, riding a horse with a dress, so she's sitting on her side, the horse is on two legs, and she's also breastfeeding. So, you know, that's why she's probably my favorite hero. When I went to Holland, I was I was invited to apply to the Rijksacademie, and I thought, okay, that's an amazing opportunity, but it also worried me. I had always been working in Argentina, and up to that point, I wasn't working with images that had to do with Argentinian history. I was just working with images that had to do with history. So I just thought, if I move abroad, I'll be like the girl who works in relationship to Argentina. And that mostly bothered me because I thought I didn't want the work to exist as a translation, so I didn't want you to have to sit here and believe that everybody in Argentina believes this house is yellow when it's white. And so I just thought I needed to explore different possibilities, and this is the presentation that I did in the first Open Studios, which is the sort of end-of-year show at the Rijksacademie. So I opened my studio, but I only opened it at 45 degrees, and I fixed the door there. And so this is the view that you would have from outside the studio. I had never had a studio up to that point, so I didn't really know what to do with it. So you're going to notice that it looks a little bit like a living room. That shows a little bit of how I felt being in the studio. I didn't really know what to do there. I had a sofa, I lied around, I read, made some drawing, mostly accumulated chocolate wrappers. So what I did is I painted everything that you could see in the studio with the color orange, which was the sort of the Dutch national color. So what you see, it was difficult to photograph, but basically everything is just painted, it's not light. But once you would come into the studio, everything that wasn't in that line of sight would have not been painted. And I guess I was sort of exploring this idea that you might have, this democratic idea that one has from a country before you go there, where everything seems to be the same, or there seems to be this identity that covers everything and then can describe it. And then when you come in, things are all of their own kind and a bit more complex. That was the first year of me being at the Rijksacademie, and even then, and very much so, this felt like a really partial solution, because I thought, okay, I don't want to go then to Japan and make work about sushi. You know, that there's a way in which site-specific practice is like every place has a history, and sometimes it compels us to engage with it, and sometimes it doesn't. And so I felt like I needed to define a practice for myself that would allow me to be able to think about things in a way that I could engage not only in a superficial level or on a surface level or on a sort of from the outside point of view. But I decided that I wasn't not going to present anything, and so I just decided to sort of perform the block. And the second year I was there, I made a work which was more about displacement, if you want. So I started thinking about how I could take advantage of these feelings of the work maybe not operating on the same level in different contexts. And so I decided to make a work about nostalgia and the rhetorics of it. This was originally happening in which there was an old, tall ship in the harbor of Amsterdam. This is the same harbor where people used to migrate to America. And this tall ship is now like a sort of museum piece, and it was going to go for a transatlantic journey. It belongs to the city of Amsterdam, so I arranged with the captain to see if I could place a camera on the boat, and without announcing it, I handed out white handkerchiefs to people who were boarding the boat and people who were on the shore to see whether they would wave. So the happening itself had that sort of question, which was like, what happens, would people recognize this as an international goodbye gesture, and would they wave without being told to? Something really interesting that happened, which you wouldn't see in the film, which is the images that you're looking at, is that people sort of play themselves saying goodbye, which is sort of a notion of parody that I've become quite interested in. That I'm not going to talk a lot about today, but it was an interesting discovery. And the other thing that I was really exploring was this sense, because I was working with ephemeral work, how to deal with the documentation of something so that it doesn't feel like you were late to the event, or that it is sort of a leftover, but it is its own thing in its own right. So I became interested in doing different versions of the same idea that would operate in different ways. So that was the happening, whereas the film, I decided to document it with a sort of 16mm black and white, a film format that made it look very old and made it look like archival footage, but at the same time, the film was 4 or 5 minutes long, so you could come through the studio and just mistake this for archival material because you would see the boat. But then the film format, and the people in the film and the boat itself, they all belong to different moments in history. They just come together to, and it appears to us as a sort of an old image, which is something that I've become very interested, because I have been very interested in performance art. And when you look at those sort of great images of Rauschenberg going around on skates with wings on his back, you think, oh, this is so beautiful. And it was probably awkward and boring and unattractive, but we see them through this grain of the film. So I became very interested in this sort of double movement of nostalgia, which is, on the one hand, it makes you remember things, because you might forget them if you don't feel nostalgic for them, but it also makes you forget them in a way in which they didn't happen, because they appear sweeter in your mind. So this is what I was exploring with this. This is just another silly work about displacement, which requires no explanation. This was the first work which I thought, it's very small, it's this big, but it's with the frame. But I thought it was a real achievement in terms of this struggle with site specificity, because it's the sort of a work that, for me, it's very anti-site specific. It is this pico tape, which is framed, and it's shown with this text next to it, and what it says, basically, I'm not going to make you read it, but it explains that this is the word nostalgia, which has been typed in the first telegraph machine that communicated America with Europe. So when they first decided to try to send a telegram across the ocean, they threw a long cable. And what happened was that because the cable was so long, by the time the message got to the end, the signal was so weak that it could not be recognized. So before they invented the telegraph pole and these repetitors that we then came to associate with the telegraph pole, with the telegraph in cities, they had a halfway station in Iceland in which somebody would just get a message and retype it and relay it onto the other side. So I went to this museum, now it's the East Iceland Museum of Technology, and I typed this word. And I thought that it was, it's a very silly piece, but it's very silly in its scale. It's quite pathetic, it's quite small, but it has that thing of, I think the only place in the planet in which you couldn't show this piece would be in Iceland, because you need to feel that Iceland, when you're reading the text, that Iceland is this very small dot in the middle of the ocean. But if you are in Iceland, you are in the center of the action, so it wouldn't work, which is why I sort of feel very fond of this work to this day. I slowly became more interested in this idea of how we can sort this distance that comes with that causes nostalgia. And I started thinking about the way we communicate, and because the earlier work was a sort of an exploration of the things that we had in common through school, these sort of school images. I have, to this day, continued to explore a notion of cultural intimacy, and communication plays an enormous role, as it is the way that we are together and we live together. This is a work which is a mural made out of photocopies. It's called Sorry for the Metaphor. As you see, that's me, and I'm holding a megaphone. But I'm sort of speaking to, or not really speaking, but about to speak, or maybe after speaking to this sort of empty landscape. What I wanted to do here was to equate the notion, or the art historical notion of romanticism and our relationship to it, and the desire that I have to this day as an artist, that art could be more effective in a civic context, that we could have things to say, and that we could find a voice through it, and that art would have that effectiveness, and that relationship to the political landscape, as this work tries to recognize that position in which the political landscape is what feels sublime to me now, rather than landscape or nature. Is this a sort of enormity of a reality that makes me feel very small, and I don't know how I would or could make any difference, or whether I would have to say anything that would be meaningful. So that's what this work is. It's a series. I guess it sort of apologizes for the metaphor because of the ineffectiveness of it. That sort of led me to a formal exploration of the pedestal on one side, and other artifacts for communication, and technologies that have become obsolete. Because I think, in a sense, I was trying to equate this sort of sending out of a message to what it feels like to make art, and not know whether somebody else would receive this message. And even if they care to look at it, they should interpret it in a different way. So I always felt that the failed attempts to communicate something, or these dead technologies, were more accurate, a metaphor or a parable for art making than sort of an efficient mode of communication. This is a series of replicas of antennas that only receive analog signal. They were first shown and made for this room, which is in Japan, in Nagoya, in front of the TV tower. And that was the year that Japanese television was going digital, so all these antennas that people make all over the world to receive this signal were becoming obsolete, and I wanted to look at them as sculptures and in their sort of objectual beauty. I also, some of them are models that I gathered from the internet or after years of being interested in them, and some of them are sculptures that could be wired as antennas, as television antennas. These are this is sort of part of a series of works in which I was looking at different modes of sending a message. And then I became very interested in listening because I felt that in this sort of hypothetical question on whether artists are saying something or whether art can act as language, there's always this notion of enunciation, which is that you don't have all these thoughts that you want to express and then you just say them. But it is that in the act of saying, it's in the act of saying that thought is performed, if you want, that you are thinking as you are talking to someone. You don't have all these pre-cooked ideas and you just sort of dump them on people, but you talk to people in a way that makes you think and it makes you organize your thoughts and it produces thoughts. So I always thought that that sort of notion of a listener, it is the figure that makes the conversation or even the beginning of the message possible. So I started to try to make a series of works in which listening would become a visual artifact, so that there would be an image that would evoke listening rather than an acoustic work, so that I would remain visual. This is a glass that is stuck to the wall, and it's performed by a person who comes and listens, who is paid to come in and listen in. This is another work which is called eavesdropping, in which there's this more sort of formal array of listeners, if you want. This was sort of exploring the luxurious aspect of silence. There are earplugs which have been dipped in different precious metals. This is a recreation of, not a recreation, a reimagination of an acoustic radar, which were very experimental devices that the British built in the First World War to try to predict airplane bombing. Some of them are of an architectural scale, and they sit on the coast. I think Tacit Din made a film about a set of them, which are called the Years. They also had portable ones that could sort of be taken to the fields. They never really worked as such, or it's like they couldn't anticipate the airplane noise for long enough that would make a difference for people to seek shelter. But they did contribute a lot to the development of radar technology. So this is also an object that has a person who comes in and listens. I very often, with my performative work, like to sort of explore that relationship of interdependency that we have with objects, so that objects would exist on their own right, but they can also be performed as such or activated, so that they exist independently of the performance, but they can also be activated by the human body. This is another work which is called Switchboard, this was part of my Chisenhall exhibition here in London, and it's a wall in which there are different interconnecting tin can telephones, which people can use, and it seems to be like work that invites participation, but the truth is it also really complicates it, because the scale of the work is so large that people cannot really easily find each other in the different holes. So I like to think of it as a sort of machine of lost stories. These are sculptures that also have to do with language. I am not sure if I have enough time to go through them, but they are built with objects which are all named by metaphors, a very particular part of kind of metaphor which is called catachresis, which is what we call an object that doesn't have a name. So let's say the leg of a chair that's a metaphor, but because it doesn't have any other name, we just don't think of it as a metaphor. Very often they're anthropomorphic. So what I liked about this is sort of the hidden aspect of them and their sort of how they carry that sense of figuration. So even though you might look at this sculpture and not really know that it is sort of an assemblage of things that have legs, in this case a leg and a tongue from the shoe, but that you will still look at them and project this anthropomorphic image on things, which is the way that we look, which also happens to be the way that we talk. And so that's how I became interested. This is a long series. This is a different project, which brings me back to public sculpture. This was an off-site project that I did for Chisenhall, in which there was this plant, which has a particular history, but because I don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to say it's a very nomadic species. It's obviously, this is a recreation of it in stone. But it's a very stable succulent originally from Mexico. And so what we had was we had a lending scheme where people could host it. Lisa and Luis hosted it. It was people could sign up to host it. It was in the East End. I asked some friends that are artists or are connected to art, and then we also had people related to the school projects in Chisenhall and patrons, and I just wanted to, for this, I had been commissioned to do something for the community, but I was very wary of defining what that community was. I'm planking something, so I just decided that we should try to, I thought that sometimes when we talk about community in the art world, we don't include the community of artists and art people who live around it. So this sort of traveled to different, this lady here is the first, that's me, but the shoe is the shoe of the lady who first hosted the sculpture. It had its own travel box. This is a lady, people were not asked to take photographs, but they could, and some of them shared them with me. This is a lady who hosted the sculpture on a boat. Here's a sculpture with a chicken, and here is a sculpture with some berries. All I'm going to say about this series of works is that interest in what brings us together also led me in sometimes formal and sometimes more performative explorations of celebratory items, because I think that street parties or celebrations are a sort of ritual that brings us together with people we don't know, but in a happy manner. So I think there could be these great metaphors on how we could live together better. There's sort of these moments of shared happiness, if you want. So this is, it's called Stabile after Calder, who had mobiles and stabiles. So this is a bunch of confetti that I scotch taped to the ground, one by one, so to try to fix that sort of happy moment. And this is the last series of work that I want to talk about, which has extended to the present. This work is called Venn diagrams under the spotlight, and it works with motion sensors. It was my contribution to one of the Venice biennials, and the biennial sort of suggested in its title and curatorial proposal a relation between education and the nation state, or knowledge, sorry, light and the nation state. So I decided to take it as enlightenment and knowledge and education. And I made this work which basically was active. The two lights come on when people activate them with their own bodies through the motion sensors. And then there's a very, in the photographs, a very faint text, but a text that you can read as a sort of subtitle that explains that Venn diagrams are mathematical illustrations that are used to describe operations of inclusion and exclusion of objects or groups of objects. So it's the area of mathematics which is dedicated to groups. And it goes on to explain that during the 1970s in Argentina, people were not allowed to gather because of the dictatorial regime. And at the same time, this kind of mathematics, all modern, so-called modern mathematics, and particularly set theory and Venn diagrams, were banned from primary school programs. My interest in that historical anecdote had to do with this sophisticated notion that there wouldn't be a possibility for a thought if there is no language to express it. So that if you wouldn't teach people how to put animals with wings and animals with legs in two different blobs and have the middle intersected with the animals who have both, then maybe they wouldn't think of coming together or something like this. And as bonkers as that sounds, I also thought it was very sophisticated, so I wanted to explore it. But as it felt like, because this was a call to talk about the nation state and I wanted to talk about education, it felt like I needed to talk about my experience, my educational experience, which was Argentina, but then again, I didn't want to go back to making work about Argentina. So that led me to this sort of performance and ongoing series, which is called A intersection B intersection C, in which the operation of set theory of the intersection, which is this one, is explored. But I wanted to explore it through presence. There's a sort of a subtext to this idea of including the human body, because during the period of dictatorship, a lot of people disappeared and their bodies were never found and their whereabouts were unknown, so they're called the disappeared. So I wanted to do something affirmative that would both emancipate that sort of philosophical notion of the model and sort of a mathematical language and its expression in social terms. So emancipate it from the historical anecdote, but also do this through the presence of the human body. So this is a room which is full of these shapes, which are made of perspex, and there's a set of performers who come in and pick a shape each and stand together in the center, facing the audience, and they form these different geometrical compositions, applying the principle of intersection. They always pick a different shape, so the compositions are always different. They hold it for a few seconds, and then they go and leave the shape and pick another one. So the way that they come together is always different. They come together in a sort of a composition is always different, because they pick sort of random shapes. So I started to look at these compositions as this sort of unique visualization of these moments which weren't going to be repeated, because they would never pick the same shape. At the same time, the room is constantly changing because they leave the shapes in different places. This takes place regularly throughout the exhibition period. And so I decided to take that performance as like the new myth of origin that would allow for a new historical narrative to unfold, in this case a fictional one. So I commissioned a photographer to document the performance in black and white, which of course is a massive loss of information, so I was interested in introducing this sort of loss between the documentation of something or the way that we remember it. And then from them, based on these photographs, I built these sculptures which are memorials to those intersections, to those very unique moments in which these actors came together and formed these particular composition. So the body is removed and the colors are reimagined because the original information of the color is not there. So there's like this introduction of a historical mistake, if you want, or a deliberate reinterpretation of it. So they're called Memorial for Intersections. In this particular show, which was in the Kunsthalle Lisbon, what we did is we just showed one sculpture, but we would change it every week. So it was sort of an attempt to re-inject this notion of performativity to this very civic function of memorials that sculptures might have. These are different ones. And this is the latest sort of iteration of this piece, in which I also got together with a filmmaker who made a double screen film installation from it, and I made some sculptures that immortalize some of the intersections that take place in the film. The big orange rectangle that you see at the end was me blocking one of the entrances to one of the spaces with colored perspex. I basically wanted to one of the things that's interesting about performing the piece is that you get to see the audience through this colored lens. So I wanted people to be able to experience what it felt like to be on the other side of the perspex. So when you came into the space, you would see this sort of bunch of sculptures, and then you'd look to your right, and there was a room that was blocked, but you could look into it. And then there was another room, which was the projection room where the film was, which is, you would enter it through this tunnel over here. And there was this blue thing that you see there is a window that looks into the projection room. So on the one hand, you see the sculpture. So what you see, this girl holding the circle, that's part of the film. And this is the reflection of one of the sculptures that is on the main space. And this is the view that you'd had from the projection room into the space. And this is sort of what the film looks like. I'm not going to play it because we don't have time. But basically, what happens is that the filmmaker decided to film the performance at the point of intersection and zoom in and zoom out, so that zoom travels throughout the two different screens. But there are moments, like this case, in which the image seems to come together into like a third intersected image. So that's what the two screen projections are exploring. These are other bits, which I'm not going to talk about. But this is a language, which is an abstract language, which is I made up, which is based on the different shapes and colors that appear in the film. So the film has a soundtrack, which is actors just speaking this language to the shapes, so describing these intersections that take place in the film with these abstract words that have a syntaxes, but and to a certain extent have a narrative, but they have no meaning other than describing what is happening. This is what the script looks like, and it's going to, so the film is going to be shown tomorrow at the Whitechapel, and there will be a reading of the script. So I thought it was a good way to finish. This is probably the last bit of work that I'll be doing with this series, but it was interesting for me to finish in a sort of performance. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I think we maybe have time to take 2 or 3 questions, if there are questions.
Yeah, I'm happy, but I don't know if it will be.
Please, you have.
Yeah.
Yes. You were saying you got this teacher when you first started off with the Yellow House.
Yes.
Yeah. And I feel like many projects of yours had something of a school exercise to them.
Yeah.
Like in a nice way, I find. What do you think of that? Like, do you kind of educate people a little bit?
It's a question that often, this is a discussion I have a lot with curators, because when you present your work, there's a possibility of, how does it go? They say something like, but that would be too didactic. So there's a sense of something being too didactic as it being wrong or overreaching. Which I think is a question that's very interesting. It's sort of what prompted me to start exploring the idea of the caption, which is like sort of the didactics of the exhibition space. I personally think that people will never understand what it is that you're trying to say, so there's never a danger of overreaching. But I also feel that if there's, let's say in the case of the ticker tape, the nostalgia piece, that there is information that could actually make you look at the work very different. I feel that if I withheld that information, I mean, I don't want to ask people to decipher. I want to ask people to look. So if there's something to decipher or something that should be known, I prefer it if it is there. So yes, I am sort of playing with that notion, but I also I'm very much for over-explaining. The reason why I wanted it to be a performer was because I was interested in achieving an image that would have to do with listening. So I was more interested in like people queuing behind the performer to get their turn, or sort of looking at her like thinking what. Like, I'm more interested in the person who listens as the thing to look at than it as an acoustic experience. In fact, I don't think it works. I don't think it really amplifies sound. Maybe it does if you sort of do it in a very specific spot, or even not against the wall, but it was more because I wanted to explore this sort of visual or sculptural aspect of the body listening than I didn't think it would be rewarding enough as an experience, if you want. I did one work, basically, which is like an acoustic work, which is about over-listening. There's this party song by Rafaela Carrà called Fiesta, and it's being played from the storage of the gallery. So you overhear it as if somebody else was having a party or something. But it's the only work in which I really explored the acoustic. And I also think that there's something quite tricky about this idea of participation, and that's when I was talking about the switchboard piece with the different telephone cans, how it seems to invite. I think very often, I don't think just picking something up or touching something or putting your head against something feels participatory enough. It doesn't feel like enough of an invitation. It doesn't feel like a generous. I don't think it would be very generous to ask someone to come and to pretend that I'm asking them to participate when there's really nothing to hear. So it's just.
I guess I find that quite an interesting contradiction, that you'd expect to hear something, but you kind of inherently know that it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting also to explore the visual aspect of it, because I think we have cinema to blame for that. The same thing with the white handkerchief. I don't think people say goodbye with a white handkerchief. We just saw it in movies. And this is what people do in movies. They hold glasses or maybe even cartoons. So it's this very, very much like a visual gesture rather than an auditory. Can we do two? Okay, we'll do two. So do you? Yeah.
If you're talking about explaining the work, I also have to think of transparency. How do you relate to transparency? Like, you don't want people to literally listen to the glasses, but you want to give them transparency in what you want to show them, and also the materials that you're using are very transparent.
Yeah. Maybe I just like clear things, but in terms of, but I think that it's tricky to attach an ethical value to a material. I'm not sure I can answer your question in relationship to my work, but I recently heard a lecture on somebody who was talking about, apparently Einstein, the filmmaker, wanted to make a film in a transparent housing block, which never happened. He never did it, but there are wonderful drawings of it. And this is the time in which, there's this corporate architecture being erected in glass, and there's this sort of great value attached to transparency as this great sort of honesty thing that you can look through. And Einstein is sort of in the storyboard. You can see that there's a moment where one of the neighbors die, and so people feel really curious, and they watch him die, and then they sort of lose interest because they can watch, and so they stop watching, and then their body's like rotting there for days. And he's sort of, I think he's going in the direction in which he's equating sort of transparency to indifference. So, which I thought was really interesting, because it was the first time that I sort of, thought, well, yeah, something is transparent doesn't mean it's necessarily good. So that's with the sort of ethical aspect of transparency. I think that in the case of the Perspex pieces, it was important because you should see this intersection. So it was also it is what gave me that potential for two things to intersect and for you to still see the outlines of them. I would lie to if I said I didn't like them visually. I think sort of visually appealing, like I think form has a lot of potential. So I'm interested in working visually with something. But in the case of the perspex, it was transparent. It was chosen because it was transparent, because it would show this sort of overlapping of two shapes.
We have at least one more question. And
Yeah.
I was curious to
we
know.
can take a few more. It's just you're very time, basically. Sorry, you have a question? Yeah.
I was curious to know what sort of drove your choices for compositions for those aspects.
I don't choose them. So what they have is,
Rather than
they're based on the photographs, on those black and white photographs. So basically, what their